So today we have yet another very interesting parable to think about. And in this parable, there are actually several levels of meaning, and I'd like to go through them briefly with you today. The first level of meaning is that this story, unlike other parables, is not primarily focused on the crop or the harvest. It's not about the weeds or the fruit. There's actually nothing wrong with the vineyard or the produce from the vineyard. The problem in this story is in the business side of the operation. The business side was not working very well at all. The problem was with the tenants who were supposed to be running the farm and the vineyard, but they weren't looking after the landowner's affairs. They had other sinister motives. They had evil intentions in mind. And as the parable continues, we discover that these tenant farmers were not only running the business into the ground, they were actually horrible people. They were mean, they were vindictive, they were evil. Not only did they harm the landowner's other servants, they literally stoned and murdered some of them. Now, in biblical times, the leasing of land to tenant farmers was a very common experience, and landowners who had extensive holdings would typically expect their tenants to turn over a portion of the crop at harvest time. If they chose not to pay the landowner, as was the case in this parable, the landowner would simply find new tenants. Someone else would be put in charge, and these wealthy landowners could usually pay others to remove them forcefully if necessary. But the rationale these tenants had for their brutality and murderous ways was stated very explicitly when they found out that the son of the owner was going to visit them. This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance. In verse 38. What a horrible expression of evil intent. Now we may think, why in heaven's name would this landowner send his own son to these tenant farmers based on what had happened to the other servants? But Jesus' parable does not highlight this act as foolish. This was not the parable of the foolish landowner. The parable is about the wicked tenants. In biblical times, there existed what we would call today an honor and shame culture. In other words, the landowner's decision to send his son as an emissary was absolutely appropriate, since he would have expected proper respect for his appointed heir by the tenant farmers. So Jesus' story, in addition to focusing on the wicked tenants, also highlights something about the landowner, his patience, and perhaps maybe his positive outlook on things. Surely they will be gracious and honorable to my son. That brings us to the second level of meaning. As Jesus continues the parable, he indicates a change in focus. No longer is the focus about the vineyard, the produce, or even these tenant farmers. At the end, Jesus has turned his attention toward the abused son. Verse 39, they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Then we that the scribes and Pharisees, who were also listening to the parable, knew that Jesus was talking about them. This parable was an allegory. In other words, various characters represented other things. The son who was sent represented God's son, Jesus. The tenant farmers represented the religious establishment and leadership. Jesus said that they would be replaced by other tenants. The vineyard was the kingdom of God. And what looked like a landowner's naivete was really part of God's plan. Verse 42, this was the Lord's doing. The scribes and Pharisees continued to realize that the parables of Jesus were directed to their own lack of leadership abilities. The crowds who heard the parable were beginning to wonder about these religious leaders as well, because like John the Baptist, they saw Jesus and John both as prophets. And while on the first level, this was a parable about the actions of wicked tenant farmers, on the second level, it was also a story about the abused son, especially Once Jesus quoted that passage from Psalm 118. The stone the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Then we come to the third level of meaning. And the third level of meaning, it really focuses on that term, the landowner. The term in Greek can be translated also as the household master. This term is really a common analogy for God, because God is often described in that Greek term, oikodespotes. Throughout the Old Testament, the understanding is that God is the owner of all the land. God is the household master. And as we come to that third level of meaning, there's an underlying assumption here that God is the landowner, and God has somehow put us in charge of the proper care and oversight of the land, of its people, and all the other things that have been trusted to all of us as stewards. But in our human and our sinful way, we are like those who wish to receive more credit for our labor, as if we own the land, as if our efforts are what makes the vineyard flourish. But in Jesus' teaching, there was a fundamental reminder that God was still the landowner. God owns everything, and we are tenants and stewards. We're supposed to take care of what has been given to us. Our world is not just a playground that God has given us to live in. God's commandments are always a reminder that God has expectation for God's people, and we have been chosen not for privilege, but for service and for witness. We have been chosen to love creation, to love one another, to be generous and caring for our world and for each other, to make that love that God has given to us into a reality for others. But when we try to be in charge of things rather than God, it speaks of privilege. It speaks of our misuse of freedom. It speaks of our arrogance. And we can easily fall into the trap of thinking that somehow we have a right to these many blessings that are part of the world in which we live. But if we are to bear fruit, then we have to be worthy stewards. We have to care about creation. We have to care about each other, and we have to bear witness to our faith. And so the third level of meaning is about the generous Creator who has given us everything we need. It's about how we respond, not as self-serving tenants, not looking out for our own benefit, but as generous stewards, always looking to help others and to make God's creation the way God intended it. There's a story about a wealthy Texas rancher whose pastor came to visit him. And when the pastor drove up onto his vast expanse of land, he was impressed. The rancher greeted him at the door, and after some pleasantries, he said, "Let's you and I take a ride together." So they got into his fancy pickup and started driving around the acres and acres of land. And while he was driving, he would talk to the pastor, and he would say things like, "Pastor, as far as the eye can see, I'm the owner of this land. I've worked on it, I developed it, I own it, it belongs to me." Pastor listened, then replied, "You indeed have a huge ranch, thousands of acres, and you say you own the land and it belongs to you. I would only ask one question. 100 years from now, who will the owner be?" The point, of course, is that ultimately, God is the owner of everything. You and I don't own anything. We are simply stewards of this land, the earth on which we live. You and I are stewards of the gift of life that each of us has been given. You and I are stewards of our financial resources. You and I are stewards of the gospel. We are here only for a very short time, and then we're gone. And everything ultimately returns to the landowner. But our God is generous. God's generosity is overflowing, and our stewardship is our way of continuing that generosity to our planet, to one another, to our church, and ultimately in ways that would please God. Doesn't seem possible, but 50 years ago this month in Hyde Park on the south side of the city of Chicago, 2 blocks up the street from a brand new Lutheran School of Theology, 5 of us seminarians lived in a house known as the Manse. It was an older home, probably built in the early 1920s, but still in those days, pretty good condition. It was a perfect location, corner house on South University Street, close enough to walk to classes and just far enough away for a little privacy. Classes had begun just a few weeks prior and students were still moving into their apartments and student housing. We all felt very good about the 5 of us being actually able to live in a house rather than an apartment. We had our family meals together every evening. We even managed to adopt a rescue dog to live with us that we love and enjoyed. We named her Effie. She was named after the last 3 words of Mark's gospel in the Greek. Epho buntogar, translated, it meant, for they were afraid. Not that we were afraid of Effie. She had her moments, but all in all, she was a good dog. And she got along well with our other pet, our parrot, who also lived with us in the house and would make some interesting word combinations from time to time. Back in those days, we were a pretty eclectic bunch of guys with some very interesting backgrounds and even more interesting part-time jobs. And all of us were in our senior years, just returning from a year of internship and looking forward to our first call to a congregation. On a personal note, Susie and I had just gotten engaged that summer, and we were planning a December wedding back in her hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was in Chicago that fall. She was in Michigan. And so we were in the midst of planning and trying to get enough money together to actually afford a wedding. Back in 1970, even after cutting as many corners as possible, life was still pretty tight, pretty expensive for a senior seminarian with no job and a brand new elementary school teacher just starting a teaching career. Anyway, on a Saturday night, back at the Manse, 4 of us decided to go out to a movie. Bob Hagstrom, the other guy, had a date that night. The point is that we were all gone from the house for several hours. When we got back to the Manse, walked in, we couldn't believe our eyes. Where was Effie? Where was the parrot? Where was our furniture and our lamps in the living room? We went upstairs in the bedrooms and the closets were bare. Absolutely no clothes in them. The drawers of the dresser had been emptied. Downstairs, half the kitchen pots and pans were gone. Food in the cupboards was gone. Someone had literally come into our home and cleaned us out. Later, we joked that one of the guys, Swanee, was the only one whose clothes were left in the closet because they were so old and grubby, not even the burglars had bothered to take them. But we lost our television, our cassette players, our LP albums and turntables, a stereo. I had some really nice sport coats and blazers and slacks and socks and shoes and underwear and coats. Literally everything had been taken. These break-in burglars had wiped us out. We, of course, called the police. They came over and we told them what we had found when we got home. Their theory was that somebody had just backed up a van or a truck or something and started hauling things out. Did anyone notice that was around there? Obviously not. They probably just figured students moving in. They didn't realize they were taking things out, not bringing things in. How could we get anything back? They asked us, did you have serial numbers or descriptions of the items? Of course we didn't. We told them we had lost these things, but it was all by memory of what we had brought to school that semester. The police suggested that we go down to Maxwell Street, where lots of vendors would sell things on the black market that others had fenced. So on Sunday morning, after church, that's where we went, but we didn't find anything that we recognized at all. We were totally despondent. Literally, all we had was the clothes on our back and what money was in our wallets. The story of our misfortune spread quickly throughout the seminary community, and then some amazing things started to happen. Back in those days, we had chapel every day, and the students would gather at 10 o'clock for a brief service and then head down to the cafeteria for coffee and a roll. Tuesday of the next week after the break-in, an announcement was made by the worship leader of what had happened at the Mass that past weekend. And then what occurred was truly a story of generosity. The next day, our fellow seminarians, professors, and staff brought clothes to the seminary for all of us to see what might fit, if any. Seminary president, Dr. Stuart Herman, gave me his brand new plaid sport jacket, which he had just purchased. Other professors and students poured out their hearts. They took a special offering and shared it with all of us to try to provide some financial support for us. They brought us food, they brought us toiletries, they prayed with us and for us. People came through, tried to help us as best they could through this mini crisis. Back in Grand Rapids, Michigan, my former intern congregation, Bethlehem Lutheran Church, also took a special offering to help me pay for housing and food for the remaining months of the semester. This outpouring of generosity by so many was truly humbling. Obviously, as students, we didn't have a whole lot of financial resources, but even what we did have had been stolen from us. We were at the bottom in terms of money, clothes, food, and financial resources. But when I reflect back on what this meant to me at that time, I do believe that this outpouring of generosity imprinted a memory that came back to me over and over again throughout my ministry, because generosity always breeds generosity. Giving begets giving. Sharing and giving to others makes our lives so much more meaningful. Caring for others is our loving response to a God who never stops caring for us. Over the years, I remembered all those people who helped this senior seminarian out in ways I could never have anticipated. And the beautiful thing about it was that most of these gifts were anonymous. None of us really knew who had given what, but we all knew that the love and concern for us had been overwhelming and was so appreciated beyond anything we could have possibly imagined. My home congregation back in Omaha, Nebraska heard about what had happened, and several months later, a special check came to Susan and I 1 month before graduation. At that time, we were struggling to find enough money to pay our school debts and housing, and then this check came in the mail. I had no idea this was happening, but it came just at the right time when we were stretched to the maximum to pay our bills. Generosity was overflowing. And over the years, Susan and I have worked throughout our ministry to continue that expression of generosity through our congregations, our children, our friends, our colleagues at work. We've always encouraged others to do the same. Unfortunately, the default position of so many people is not always generosity. Sometimes it's selfishness and stinginess, and it happens to Christians as easily as non-Christians. Someone may be a strong believer and a spiritual leader, but when it comes to money, they shrink back. They're not generous, and they always seem to focus on what's best for them. Some may say, well, I give to the poor, I give to charities, I give to my congregation. Yes, we may have done that and continue to do that. But the real test that usually works for me is this: would people around me describe me as generous? So here's a question to think about. Would people around you describe you as generous? If so, fantastic. If not, then you're not generous. It's as simple as that. Generosity breeds generosity. When you sow generously, you reap generously. When you're generous toward others, most people are generous toward you. Remember St. Paul's words: Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Giving people are usually very happy people. There's something about them that frees them to be all that God wants them to be. On the other hand, those who are not generous carry with them also a certain demeanor, a certain spirit. They are bound by their own lack of generosity and their poverty of spirit, and they are unable to fully accomplish what God has called them to do and to be. Always remember that we worship a generous God. So my encouragement and prayer for you is this: to always be generous, to always be focused on the needs of others before your own, to always care about our world that God has given us to live in, and most importantly, to remember that generosity always breeds generosity. Amen.